get started with the meeting this evening. Thank you all for coming and welcome to our meeting tonight to discuss local housing issues. Before we introduce our guests who are here to do a presentation and answer our questions, I wanted to step back and give a little background and talk about how we're going to run this evening. As many of you probably know who are here tonight, because there are many familiar faces, in 2016, the then City Council established a number of priorities for the city. Among those priorities was the creation of a livable community for all, and it included creating a community-wide strategic plan for the purpose of ensuring that a range of safe, quality, and stable housing options are available for residents of varying incomes. So that was back in 2016, the then City Council adopted that priority. And then in February of 2016, we convened a community conversation on affordable housing. And that was a day where we brought in people from national, regional, and local organizations and experts to talk about housing trends and the current status of housing in the city. We then broke up into smaller discussion groups of residents to identify what affordable housing means to residents here in Takoma Park. We have a record of all those presentations and that day on the city website if you're interested in going back and viewing those. And then in the budget that year, the council began the Affordable Housing Reserve to ensure that we had the resources to undertake new initiatives to address our diverse housing needs in the city. And we have continued over the last couple of budgets to put money into that reserve. And right now we have about $700,000 in the reserve. And then last year, we piloted our first program to address housing needs in the community, or not the first program, but the first new program under this new priority, which was called the Home Stretch Program. It is a down payment assistance program to assist first-time home buyers to help them purchase a home in the city. So since 2016, we've established a priority. We've pulled together residents in an initial community conversation, set aside funding, and piloted a new program in the city. The City Council had lots of ideas of what to do with the Housing Reserve and how to move forward on this initiative. But we worked with the city staff, and we're very thankful for their diligent work in putting together many of the things that we have now, and suggesting to the City Council at the time that we hire consultants to help us think through strategically what is the best way to move forward in the city. And so that's what we did. We went out and we hired the Cloudburst Group, which pulled together consultants, and we have with us tonight two of the consultants, Marjorie Willow and Bill Wazaliski. Pretty close, okay. And they're going to talk to us specifically about the draft strategic plan that many of you have seen regarding housing options in the city. Up to this point, before tonight, we've had community input through an online survey. They've done stakeholder interviews. We've had listening sessions, 2 open houses, and an online comment form. And we thought after all of that, looking through your comments, that we actually wanted to invite Marjorie and Bill here in person to answer the questions that we, the City Council, have regarding their draft report and residents have. So as we go through tonight, what we're going to do first is Marjorie and Bill are going to do a presentation. And then we'll have a short amount of time for the City Council to answer clarifying questions, and then open it up to residents who are here tonight to answer questions. You can do that in one of 2 ways. We do have microphones here that you can come up and ask a question at the microphone. We also, over here to my right, there's pieces of paper where you can write questions or comments, and if you don't want to call them out or say them yourself, we can have some city staff read them, or we can collect them and read them later. In addition, we are doing Facebook Live this evening, so if you are at home, or if you know people who are at home and would like to follow us along on Facebook and provide comments that way, we will also be taking comments and questions from Facebook. So I think with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Marjorie and Bill.
Thanks. This is why I bring him. So as the mayor said, this was a joint project between three consulting firms under the Cloudburst umbrella. And our firm, Mullen and Lonergan Associates, was responsible for the housing element of the strategic plan. So to place the plan in context, we look to the city's mission of striving to be a livable community for all. And what this conjured up for us was really a plan that included recommendations toward increasing equity, access to housing, as well as viability of the recommendations that we were going to make. And the plan is designed to create a higher quality of life for current residents of Takoma Park as well as future residents. Our biggest challenge as we were working with staff and stakeholders was to preserve the range of housing options while maintaining affordability of the existing housing stock, particularly rental units. So while many of you may have read the plan, especially on council, there were a lot of numbers, a lot of percentages and dollar signs, a lot of statistics in the plan. And I did want to spend just one slide reiterating some very significant trends that we thought were important to remind everyone tonight. Again, it puts the rest of our recommendations in context for everyone. So Takoma Park we saw as an island in the region where renters are relatively balanced with owners. Although home ownership, it has been shifting toward higher home ownership rates over the past decade. But owners are about 53% and renters are about 47%. The median sales price for housing, a homeowner-occupied housing, has increased from $407,000 to $475,000, almost $500,000 over the past 5 years. That was a 7% increase. The median rent, so the rent at which half of renters pay less and half of renters pay more in Takoma Park is almost $1,100, but it's still 22% lower than surrounding areas and nearly 50% lower than Montgomery County overall. So even though some of you might think you're paying a lot of rent, and you could very well be, it's still lower than in surrounding areas. Takoma Park and the county have very low residential vacancy rates, between 1% and 2% for the last couple of years, which means the housing market is very tight. So waiting lists are very long, and units that are placed for sale go very quickly. There's just not a lot of stock out there to rent or to buy. No new multifamily construction since the 1970s. The most code violations have been issued for very large rental properties. Takoma Park is only one of 2 jurisdictions, with the district being the second one, that have rent stabilization ordinances in the region. And this was really an emphasis in the economic development element of the plan, but the purple line will disrupt housing in Takoma Park. And you can look at that in a few ways. You know, where the line will go, there will be some physical disruption. But in terms of what the line can bring, it could also cause disruption in the availability of future housing, the size, the cost of new housing that could be developed, the new types of housing that might be available as a result of the purple line. So altogether, the regional growth in the area will continue to increase demand for housing, and what that means is that there's going to be pressure then for on the cost of housing, in terms of rental rates, and on sales prices in housing. So our presentation tonight focuses on the recommendations that we made that, if implemented, would enable the city to achieve its housing goal of preservation and expansion of existing housing options for current and future residents. So one of the recommendations was to modify the pilot program. So the city has what's called a payment in lieu of taxes initiative. And this is typically associated with the low-income housing tax credit program. And the city uses the pilot program where the taxes that the owner pays on the property, the city will exempt them as part of its match in order for the housing development to occur. And what staff told us was that while this has been done for some time, there's no database, there's no list, there's no systematic review of who has received it, how much, how far back. There's not a central place for this information to be gathered. And so our recommendation was to create the database, to track it, manage it, and analyze it, if for no other reason, for there to be better program management, but primarily for staff to have the ability to monitor what the impact of that tax exemption basically has on the projects, and to identify if there needs to be changes. So some of the things that could possibly come out of analyzing this incentive that the city offers is knowing how far back the tax exemption was made, and knowing if if the period of affordability for those projects is ending and it will then be converted to market rate units, the city would want to make sure that that exemption is no longer on the books for that property. And the second point is that it's also a way for the city to track when the period of affordability might end for these units. Usually that period is anywhere from 15 to 30 years. And if there is pressure on an affordable housing provider to sell and convert to market rate, which can be much more lucrative in a market like this, then the city could work with a nonprofit to step in, acquire those units, and keep them affordable, because it's less costly to acquire units already developed than to build new, especially when you have so little land for developing. The next recommendation is to make the emergency assistance program available to refugees and immigrants. So one of the things that we identified was that there are higher rates of refugees and immigrants in Takoma Park than in the state or the U.S. overall. And quite frequently they have difficulty accessing affordable housing as citizenship status limits their eligibility for federal housing programs. And so our recommendation is to modify your program that would, and make it allowable for refugees and immigrants to access the program, to receive a one-time security deposit in order to be able to rent in Takoma Park. Quite often that can be a steep price for them to access rental housing, but it can also be an opportunity to help people who need rental housing in Takoma Park be able to access it if that's their only barrier to being able to get housing. And one thing that can be done is to engage with the community in places where refugees and immigrants might gather, such as churches or stores or other community gathering spaces, and market the program. In terms of degree of difficulty to get this particular initiative off the ground, this is one that has would be relatively easy to do, and the cost is probably low to moderate, depending on the amount of down payment that would be needed. But this is an initiative that could be relatively quickly implemented. The next recommendation is to enforce the rental licensing program. So particularly among the larger rental properties in the city, one of the things that, or several of the comments that the stakeholders that we interviewed including staff, said that without the rental program, without aggressive enforcement of it, then there's prolonged neglect and deferred maintenance, which causes more deterioration of these older units, these older rental units. Preservation of the units is less costly than demolition and new construction, which means that it's important to maintain the quality of the units as much as possible. But stakeholders also complained of weak enforcement, especially among what they called known slumlords, and licensing that was still issued even though there were known code deficiencies or code violations issued. And so our recommendation is to aggressively enforce the program for violations and noncompliance in order to preserve the rental stock. Again, recognizing that there is little, if any, land available for development, particularly for larger rental properties in order to replace older housing units. It really becomes imperative then that the current rental housing stock is preserved as long as it's financially feasible to do so. So enforcement should include increasing fees for noncompliance, higher maintenance restriction standards for repeat offenders, maybe more frequent inspections even. In terms of the degree of difficulty to implement this, I would say it's moderately to difficult to implement because of the issues that are involved, because of the interaction between code enforcement and property owners and perhaps the legal system in order to bring them into compliance, which can be very time-consuming as well. And in terms of cost, it's at least moderately costly because of the cost of consistent code enforcement and repeat visits to the same properties. The next recommendation is our recommendation to assess higher property tax on vacant structures. So the city has a vacant structure assessment fee of $200 each year. And the purpose of the fee is to discourage abandonment and neglect. And there were 85 total properties identified as vacant in 2016. So by increasing the fee, you could achieve results. You would want to achieve results of incentivizing the owner to either sell the property, rehabilitate it, redevelop it for reuse, or demolish it, and then put that property back to full use, either through redevelopment or reuse or sale, and get it on the tax rolls at the rate that could be enjoined from a fully usable property. It also makes vacant structures or cleared parcels available for reuse or redevelopment, and the revenue generated from the higher fee could finance affordable housing initiatives in the city. The next recommendation is to explore the feasibility of using nonprofit property management organizations. So this recommendation evolved out of our meeting with the tenant capacity building organizations who reported that some of the larger buildings are not managed well, and they felt that the city could potentially gain from exploring the feasibility of using a local nonprofit organization to manage rental properties. The thinking behind that is that if you're using a local organization with local residents who are doing the property management of a particular building or buildings, whatever is under contract, then there is a greater sense of personal stake in the management process because it's a local group with local residents. And it's also a local job generator. So our recommendation would be to provide seed money to start a pilot program in the very beginning. In terms of degree of difficulty, this is probably close to moderate in terms of difficulty. In terms of seed money for cost, it's probably low to moderate, but this would take training and really exploring the feasibility of a local group doing this. The next recommendation is to amend the rent stabilization ordinance. So this was an issue that came up quite frequently in our interviews with stakeholders as well as staff. And one of the things we learned was that regardless of a household's rent, they still are able to pay the stabilized rent for the unit. And in terms of property owners, the fair return on investment process, as we learned it, can be a very complex process for them to request rent increases. And there's really little incentive to reinvest in the properties without adequate rent revenue to pay the debt service to finance the substantial renovations that might be necessary in order to upgrade the units. And so our recommendation is to amend the ordinance and limit the rent stabilization to households earning up to 100%, could also be 120%, but to limit it to a level of median income benefit. And then households above that limit, that income limit, would pay closer to the market rate for the units. You could also have a sort of a tiered approach based on your income, how much you're going to pay. But the result is that there is an opportunity for the owners to receive additional rent for the purpose of making renovations. The result of this would be creating mixed income buildings. So some people would be paying more, some people would be paying less, but it would be based more on your income. It would generate additional rental income revenue for owners to reinvest in the property. And it also helps to preserve the affordable rental housing by encouraging, incentivizing the owners to carry out the necessary renovations on their properties. I think one of the most unique programs that I encountered in Takoma Park was the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase program. So that tenants have the opportunity to purchase their multifamily rental property if it's placed for sale. The city does provide funding to the tenant capacity building organizations to assist the tenants in facilitating the purchase of the property. And this also includes affordable rental housing financed by federal and state funds with a mandated affordability period. And so this is, it's our understanding this has only been achieved once in Takoma Park, where the tenants purchase their property. But our recommendation is that if it happens to be a rental property that is already under the required affordability period. So if it's a tax credit project or whatever the federal source of funding is that says that this building has to remain affordable for 15 or 20 or 25 years, that if it is placed for sale, as long as that period of affordability is still in place, then that particular property should be waived from the program simply because it's already it already has sort of a rent stabilization mechanism in place in that the rents are set and cannot be increased, and only income eligible households can move into the property. In terms of difficulty, degree of difficulty, we think this one would be relatively easy. And in terms of a cost, it would probably be just a program guideline modification. So very easy. The next recommendation is to modify the homestretch down payment assistance program. So as the mayor mentioned in her opening remarks, the city did capitalize this program with $50,000 in 2017. So they made available this pot of money that eligible home buyers could qualify for up to $10,000 for down payment and closing cost if they were buying a home in the city. But only one of 23 applicants in 2016 was able to find and purchase a home in Takoma Park. And remember, in the beginning, I said that the median sales price was $475,000 in 2016. So it meant that all of the units that sold, that 475,000 was the halfway mark. Half of the units sold for less than that amount, and half of the units sold for more than that amount. And even among the half of the units that sold for less than $475,000, only one home buyer applicant was able to find and purchase the house. So our recommendation is to partner with local lenders looking for CRA credits, so Community Reinvestment Act credits, to help boost those loan funds. So lenders, most lenders, are required to comply with their CRA requirements, which is a federal program requirements. And they might be willing to contribute to that pot of funds as well, so you can increase the amount of funds available with the plan to increase the amount that would be loaned, that would be granted to each home buyer. So instead of just $10,000, they probably need well in excess of $20,000, maybe closer to $40,000 or $50,000 even, depending on the sales price of the house that they buy. The other option too is to offer for the city to offer a soft second mortgage for a single family home purchase. And basically what this means is if the buyer qualifies for only a $150,000 mortgage, but the sales price of the house is $200,000, then the city would cover the gap, that $50,000 gap, and attach a recorded lien on the property, meaning you only receive payback once that property is sold. And if you establish that as a revolving loan fund, then the repayment returns to the city's housing reserve fund for reinvestment. Another recommendation is to partner with realtors who could help market this initiative. So by informing realtors of the program details, then if they have a client who, based on the program guidelines and the client's income eligibility, they can say, hey, the city of Takoma Park has this great program, you might qualify for it. And that's another way to help get the program marketed to the general public. And we would also recommend that you require applicants to any homeowner assistance program that you have to complete home ownership and credit counseling to increase their sustainability of home ownership. So my partner here likes to say he can put anybody in a house, but the real challenge is to ensure that they're in that house 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, when the water tank goes out, when the roof needs to be replaced. So that's what the benefit of a home ownership and credit counseling can do for new home buyers, especially if they're first-time home buyers, to fully understand the responsibility and the financial responsibility that they're taking on. In terms of degree of difficulty, this could be moderately costly depending on how much more you might want to consider contributing to the program. In terms of sort of the load to lift here, I'd say low to moderate, especially if you can get partners to help you market the program as well as contribute to the funding for the program. So one of the things that we heard throughout our process, as well as in preparing for tonight, is that there's a lot of emphasis on renters and rental housing in the plan, and there is. And we wanted to emphasize homeowners as well. You know, what is available for homeowners? It's not quite as much in terms of public funding at the state and federal level, but there is a program at the state for home funds, And the city of Takoma Park is an eligible applicant. And what we did learn when we did a lot of the data research was that even though there are more, by number, there are more cost burden, more renters are paying more than 30% of their income for housing costs. Homeowners, the percentage is higher. So as a homeowner, you're far more likely to be cost burdened than if you're a renter, paying more than 30% of your income on housing. And that's a pretty good marker, because the more you have to spend on your housing, if you're paying half your income on housing, then there's a lot less to pay for medicines, for health care, for food, for transportation, for heating bills in the wintertime. And so our recommendation is for the city to apply for funding, because the homeowners who would be eligible for the funds can earn as much as 55% of the state median income, which means in Takoma Park, if you're a homeowner, for a family of four, a household of four, that means you can earn as much as $60,650 to qualify for the program. And that number, the dollar number, the income level is adjusted based on the number of people in your household. So by determining a funding mechanism for homeowner-occupied rehabilitation, then it's a way for the city to preserve the housing stock among low and moderate income homeowners in the city. And if those funds are used to make energy efficiency improvements, like changing out the windows, for example, throughout the entire house, that can lower utility cost, which is a monthly reoccurring cost, which could greatly lower the cost burden of what you're having to pay each month in your housing costs, because utilities are part of your housing cost. And it also lessens the cost burden among low and moderate income homeowners, as we said. In terms of the degree of difficulty for this one, it's an application, but then there's staff for administration of the program and management and getting contractors to do the work. So I would say it's probably a moderate. In terms of cost to the city, you can use part of the fund to pay the admin cost, or the city can pick up the admin cost, therefore making more of the grant funds available to the homeowners. That's a decision for the city. One of our recommendations is to continue the tenant rights course. So this is a great program in a city of a lot of renters that the city uses to provide its renters with technical assistance, and also it allows the city to interact with its rental residents on a regular basis. And so this is a biannual course. It's offered twice a year. Focuses on tenant-landlord relationships, municipal code regulations, and tenant protections. So what are your roles as a tenant? What are your rights? What are your responsibilities? And the purpose of it is to ensure that tenants have consistent access to information that govern their tenancies, their ability to rent in the city. And the stakeholders that we interviewed told us that this was really important because there is a high percentage of long-term tenants that are living in Takoma Park, and often in the same units. So our recommendation is to offer that tenant rights course in an online format, so it's accessible on demand 24/7 to any tenant who wants to watch it, especially those who are part of the workforce and work odd hours, work 2 jobs, can't come to a class, have babysitting or transportation challenges. Just make it more widely available for everyone. And in terms of degree of difficulty, this would be, I'd say, fairly easy to implement and fairly low cost. We'd also recommend continuing the tenant-landlord mediation activities. So the city has a very successful program to prevent and resolve disputes between tenants and their landlords. In 2016, the city had over 2,500 contacts through the program, meaning interactions, people called in requesting information. 3 cases were filed and 2 hearings were conducted by the commission. And our recommendation is to continue this initiative because the mediation assists in resolving disputes and prevents more serious and costly actions. And tenants are able then to maintain their housing in the housing they're living in at that time. In terms of degree of difficulty, for implementation, very easy because you're already doing it. In terms of cost, whatever the current cost is, unless you decide to expand it in some way. The next recommendation is to encourage accessory dwelling units, ADUs. So a lot of people think of these as garage apartments, a living space above a garage, or a small cottage in the backyard. But what these can do is create affordable housing for relatives. So not necessarily a garage apartment, but if it's something that has a no or low, no step entrance, low maintenance in terms of a single floor plan for persons with disabilities or persons who wish to age in place. They can do that on living with family members very close by. But what we did learn was that there are restrictions in place in the zoning ordinance that don't really encourage the development of the accessory dwelling units. So right now, they have to be attached to the primary residence, meaning that if you have this little apartment, it has to be physically part of the primary residence on the lot. It can be located no closer than 500 feet from another accessory dwelling unit. So probably for as close as the lots are, neighbors could not have them, even if they had the space on their lot to put them. And it has to have a secondary egress. And what that means is if it's connected to the house, there's an entryway from the house into the unit, but it also has to have its own exit from that accessory dwelling unit itself. And so our recommendation is to collaborate with the county, who administers the city's zoning, to develop an overlay district allowing these accessory dwelling units in appropriate locations in the city. Expand the regulations so that it can either be a detached or an attached dwelling unit. Eliminate the 500-foot distancing requirement and permit basements and attics as allowable accessory dwelling units, along with units above garages or small cottages and backyards. There's quite a variety of different ways and designs for accessory dwelling units, but it is a mechanism by which families in today's environment, where kids who have college degrees but no jobs are moving back in order to be able to pay for their college loans, as well as older parents who might be needing to live with you so that they're right there. So it fills both a younger and an older generational housing need. We would also recommend that the city grow the Takoma Park Housing Reserve Fund. So this is a local fund dedicated solely to the production and preservation of affordable housing, and it can be used to finance several of the plan's initiatives, the recommendations that we're recommending. And the local fund would have fewer restrictions than state and federal funding resources. So when the city creates this housing fund, it can place the restrictions on it that it wants. I can almost guarantee you it will not be nearly as burdensome as the regulations from a state program or from the federal program in terms of what can be done, what can't, ineligible uses, eligible uses, who can use it, and what you have to do in order to access the money. So this is what we would basically call almost free money, because it's free of all those burdensome requirements. So you can use it for a greater variety of programs and projects, and you can set the eligibility requirements. Who is eligible to receive money for what project? That's your decision. So our recommendation specifically is to continue to dedicate a line item in the city's annual budget to keep growing the fund, and identify other local revenue generators as well, such as the vacant structure fee that we recommended increasing. In terms of degree of difficulty to implement, I would say that to implement it, it's very easy, but the level of cost would be determined by how much the city wants to contribute to it, or how much the city wants to draw from other revenue sources to finance it. So also in the entire plan, which was an economic development and housing strategy, there were 2 goals. I think the previous one was. Yeah, the previous one. So the Takoma Park Housing Reserve, that was also an economic development goal that I wanted to mention tonight. This is also an economic development goal because it does touch on housing. So the facilitate the creation of a community land trust. So a community land trust is an organization that's run by a nonprofit, and basically they buy the land and own it, on which affordable housing then is built or already sits. And the reason this is important is because if the community land trust owns the land and you're going to build new housing on it, the cost of the land is subtracted from the development of the housing. So that's a huge expense that is not factored in. So it is more affordable to construct housing on land that is owned by a community land trust. And the way that it works is that a bank or a lender loans a home buyer the money to buy the house on the land, and then the home buyer leases for a nominal fee each year the land from the community land trust. But what happens when that home buyer wants to sell for whatever reason, they get the house may have appreciated, so they can draw for equity from the house, but the land remains. And in this case, then the house also remains with the community land trust, so that it can be turned over to another lower income home buyer who then has the opportunity to purchase this affordable house. It also works with rental properties, although there's not as much of a transfer, but the development of the housing on land that is already owned by the community land trust is less expensive than having to acquire the land. And the county has the first right of refusal to buy condemned properties, with the city having the opportunity to purchase them. And this could be a good way to start property acquisition for a community land trust. The first thing you have to do, though, is have that nonprofit organization, the community land trust, in place. So our recommendation would be to provide operating funds for that nonprofit organization to begin operating in Takoma Park. And it could be one that's already in existence, maybe elsewhere in Montgomery County or in the district, but that then is allowed to conduct its work in the city. And the final recommendation, also an economic development goal, was to partner with Washington Adventist Hospital to plan for how the former site will be reused. So this is a very large parcel of land that has redevelopment and development potential, which is a very unusual occurrence in Takoma Park. And it's our understanding recently that the property might be transferred to Washington Adventist University for commercial redevelopment. And so our recommendation is to work with the university to try to rezone the site. This would have to be done with the county's collaboration, since they administer the zoning for the city. And this would involve a very lengthy and rather complex public planning process in order to determine what would be the best use, most compatible with surrounding uses, to be carried out on that property. And things to be considered would be density, development standards to be considered in terms of compatibility would be density, the uses, mixed use perhaps with some commercial, smaller scale commercial with residential units above street level, mixed use developments, and other development standards such as off-street parking. That's an issue here as well. In terms of degree of difficulty, off the scale, both of them. Just because of the process, the planning process. I mean, it could be 2 years just to get the zoning right if you're lucky. And the cost, you know, who knows. But because of the potential that this has for remaking a significant parcel in the city, this is one that could be well worth the investment, both time, human capacity investment, as well as funding. So we saved that one for last.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. And I just want to let people know that the full report is on the city website. And as Marjorie said, there were a number of tables and details on you know, the current housing situation in Takoma Park. So we're going to turn it over just for some quick council comment questions this evening. And then what we really want to do is spend the majority of the rest of our time before we end tonight at 9 o'clock getting residents' questions. But I see Councilmember Siemens is first up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. And Ms. Williams, or Willow, I thank you for your presentation and all the work that your organization put in doing this. I have a number of questions, so I'd like to just, the mayor's going to yell at me if I take too long. I'd like to just keep the answers kind of short and to the point, and we can discuss it more via email if we have to. Okay, you mentioned the Emergency Assistance Program. That's a program that we have now. Do we currently use that for first-time security deposits, as you suggested in the presentation?
Do I know that you do use it?
Yes. Do we use that now for first-time security deposits?
I'm not aware that you do.
I don't believe we do. And you suggested that the program should be open to and available for refugees and immigrants. But I think for the purposes that we do have the program, it's currently available for refugees and immigrants, isn't it?
Ms. Daines is here if you want to answer. Your mic's on.
This is one of those things where there's a nuance associated with it. The Emergency Assistance Program provides one-time support once a year for a variety of purposes. It's, whether or not you are an immigrant or not is irrelevant. But what this is doing is tying it back to the difficulty of finding and securing housing because of the residency requirements, for lack of another word, that many of the more affordable housing units require because of their federal or state funding. So by providing a security deposit, regardless of the immigration or citizenship status of the individual, it could support those ongoing efforts to work with local groups that are trying to identify housing for refugees and immigrants.
I just wanted to make sure and be clear that we don't discriminate
we do not discriminate.
Refugees or immigrants at this time.
We do not discriminate.
Okay, thank you. And then you mentioned the enforcement of rental licensing program. Are you suggesting that the inspectors are not enforcing the rental housing code now? Or are you alluding to the fact that we need additional regulations to broaden the inspections and the criteria?
It was our understanding from the stakeholders and from some staff that it's seeing the violations through to full compliance.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that too. That's been a concern. And it was a concern of mine. If we're not getting the job done, we need to provide the resources so we can get the job done right. But I'll also be interested to hear from you any suggestions you have for broadening the inspections and the criteria for those inspections. I believe that what we use now is a nationwide standard that in itself may not be sufficient to get the apartments into proper order. Then you also mentioned the rent stabilization and suggested making modifications to that to implement income requirements and checks on individuals' incomes. That kind of implies that you feel there is an abuse of our rent stabilization, or that we have people who are making a lot of money and living in apartments that are below market rate. Did you all do any kind of a income assessment of the tenants in the buildings?
No, that wasn't part of this study, but just by virtue of the fact that income eligibility is not a criteria to rent one of the rent stabilized units. That's why the recommendation was made, so that the individuals who can pay a market rate rent or a higher rent than the rent stabilized market would be doing so. Okay,
and my experience has been that there are very few people who make a large amount of money that are going to live in some of the buildings that we have. They're nice, but people tend to try to move up to new housing when they can afford it, just like they move up to a bigger car when they get the raise of the job. And then you also mentioned that as a comment in that same presentation that that would provide more money to the building owners, so that they would turn that around and put that into the building to upgrade the building and make improvements. And I wondered on what kind of assessment you did to come to that conclusion that they would spend the money on the building and not on themselves.
As part of the ordinance, that would allow them to charge higher rents for incomes above a certain limit. That would be the reason for granting them that right to charge higher rents.
Right, they would be able to have the higher rents, but they could put the money in the pocket and go home. Nobody says there was, I was just wondering if you had any assessment that they would, in fact, or if you had some suggestion on how we would require that money be turned back into remodeling of the building itself.
The same way that if you allow them to raise rents now, they have to put it back into the property, reinvest it.
All right. And then lastly, you were talking about zoning, and you mentioned the accessory dwelling units. I think in, as people change, evolve through time, we've gone to, some people are going to the big mansions. We mansionize everything now, only single-family residences in Takoma Park. But also there's as you see on TV, maybe the little houses. Some people are moving towards a more dense settlement, and I just wondered if you had given any thought to us advocating for higher density buildings, rental buildings here in Takoma Park, and whether that be kind of a co-living, I'm not sure what they call it, the co-housing, where they'll have like kitchen facilities and a common area, and then units around that. Did you give any thought or discussion to that in this?
Not to co-housing. No, we did not.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith?
Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys putting together this study on our affordable housing. You know, this is probably one of the biggest issues for the region, how to make sure that people can, you know, live in a quality house. But I have a few questions for you. One is the land trust. Do you know of a land trust in Montgomery County?
No, not in Montgomery County. There are two, maybe three in Maryland. We're from Pittsburgh. We know there's one. We were talking earlier. There's one in State College where Penn State is, and it's an area that has similar problems in that the cost of housing is very high and there's very little land for development. And they work very well with single-family homeowner units.
I just don't see in Montgomery County there ever being a land trust. That's just my opinion. Mixed income. We already have buildings that do have mixed income, and there are challenges with that, trying to certify individuals every year. But also that is taking out, you know, traditional rent stabilized units out of the system. And once we do that, those buildings are no longer part of our rent stabilization program. So there are challenges with doing that. Takoma Park is the only municipality in Maryland that has rent stabilization. I think that's something that we need to continue on that path. It separates us from everybody. The District of Columbia, they're getting rid of affordable units every day. So I would not like to see us reduce the number of rent stabilized units. And even if we did bring up the discussion, we have to figure out a way to add to the inventory, right? By incentivizing developers to build more properties. You know, either it's at the rec center on New Hampshire Avenue or the Washington Adventist campus. So I think that would be a better goal for us than trying to tinker with the existing housing stock, because we do have a lot of garden style apartments, and that's like you know 3 to 4 units. If you take 1 or 2 of those units out, I mean that's 50% of the number of units you know that landlord owns. But the other problem that I see is affordable housing, commercial property, residential property, a lot of times is considered an investment, right? You have people that buy these properties, whether somebody wants to flip a house or somebody wants to buy a 3, 4, 10-unit building, they buy it because they want a certain return, an internal rate of return on their investment. They did not buy into rent stabilization. And that's part of our fault, I think, that we have a lot of people that own properties here that do not feel like they need to make the investment in these properties, because when they bought those properties, all they wanted was the money. And that's a different, you know, way of looking at property, right? Because most people, if you go across the street into Silver Spring, they buy a property and they just make as much money as possible, right? But the tenants are the ones that suffer here because they're not getting the improvements. And I'm not talking about granite countertops. I'm just talking about standard improvements. The plumbing works. It's not galvanized plumbing. You know, the electric has been upgraded. A lot of tenants don't even see that here in the city. And so what I would like to see is how do we incentivize, especially these smaller 3, 4, 5 unit property owners, to be able to get the money, whether it's a loan from a bank, the city, the county, to make these improvements. Because right now, that I think is a big bottleneck to this situation. And then you have the nonprofit landlords. I think many of them do a pretty good job because they have access to capital. They can get the tax credits. They can go to the state and get money for their properties. But it's the small landlords, the guys that are competing when they go and get financing with people that owns a single-family home, because it's considered in the same category. It's not commercial property. But that's the part I think that we are having a real difficult time trying to get our hands around.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
In that scenario, if you offered a incentivized type of program, however it's structured, whether it be a grant-based, whether it's a sharing between the city and the owner, would there be significant interest in these type of owners to take advantage of that program?
I think it has to do with how much paperwork is required. Because a lot of these guys don't want to, disclose all this information that the city may require. If we could make it 1 or 2 pages and we can get in there and fix these issues, I think that's a possibility.
Would they be willing to, as part of that process, no matter how it's structured, be willing to extend the affordability period of those units? So, for example, if you made a substantial improvement grant, that it would be leaned on their property, that these have to be remain affordable for such an income tier and such a rent for a period of 10 years, 15, whatever you feel locally makes the most sense. If the answer to that is yes, I think you could probably do something like that.
I think that the council needs to stand firm and say that's what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But the final point I want to make is, how do you bend the cost curve, the increase of housing, the cost of housing, right? Because our program, we don't put money into it. It's a paper program, right? We just say our code says that these are the regulations to have affordable housing or rent stabilization. Other jurisdictions, the county, they put money into these projects. So how do we control the cost of this, of housing, when we're, like you said, we're under all this pressure, when we're not able to put money into a project, an existing development or a new project that says, okay, well, you guys are gonna, by code, you have to offer 12.5% affordable housing. We want you to offer 13% and we'll put $1 million into it. How do we do that without putting money into the project?
Yeah, again, it's you could do what I was suggesting as some form of, you got to work together with the owners, because they got to be willing to accept some benefit on their side, whether it's just a straight lien on the property that's going to maintain the affordability of those units. It's looking at globally the units of affordable housing in your community to make sure that you have we didn't get to it, but Marjorie and I were talking before we got here, that maintaining an inventory of assisted units, for example, tax credit units that what they call are getting ready to convert to market. So they're expiring subsidies, and making sure you have a very good handle on which ones those are. So 2 to 3 years before that's going to happen, you're making that call to the local owners of those properties, the property managers, and you're beginning the conversation, at least, the opportunity of working with them to preserve the affordability, either through ongoing rehabilitation, putting money into their property and then extending the affordability period of that unit, or just initially having that conversation to see what they'd be willing to listen to preserve affordability, because it is such a huge issue here. So, I mean, that is just one example, or several examples of how you could address that type of need. But it's very tricky in a very hot market. It's a very, very difficult issue.
So finally, have you guys seen nationally anybody getting this right?
That's a great question.
In terms of the smaller rental units,
Because the MHPs, the CPDCs, they can figure it out, right? Because they have access to capital. But the smaller guys, how do you solve that issue?
the challenge is to get them to buy into the period of affordability in exchange for the city giving them a low interest loan or whatever the case may be, to make the renovations. So you're not just going to give it to them where, be their bank and
Right.
then they can rent to whoever. You want to see it sustained as affordable housing. And so that's really your challenge, is to get them to agree, okay, I'll keep these units, for every 100,000 you give them, they have to keep them affordable for 10 years, for example.
The other thing I would add to that is that just in my experience doing these types of projects around the country, communities that structure their rental rehabilitation programs, as I call them, where it's more like where they're requiring the owner to put more capital upfront versus the subsidy that they're receiving, are not very successful. You have very little landlords taking advantage of that type of scenario. However, when the more subsidy and more incentive you give them, the better it is. So again, it could almost be like on the ownership side, where you would say, okay, it's gonna be a 0% loan that will convert to a grant after the agreed upon affordability period. I mean, that's one way to look at it, and that's very attractive to an investor or an owner, because that's very little outlay that they're going to have to put cash-wise. And the small mom-and-pop shops, like you were saying, don't have access to capital, right. And that's the biggest issue, right. Whereas the bigger developers and owners have access to capital to make those improvements over time. So that is a huge issue.
Thank you.
Great. I just want to jump the line and piggyback on something Councilmember Smith said. And one of the things that struck me in your recommendations is, should we step back and set some housing goals and say, like, because I don't believe we actually have sort of an inventory right now. As we were just talking about, and think about, what do we have in these larger buildings? What do we have in the smaller? What are our market value? Is that a useful exercise for us to?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, that's real world data. And if you keep it on an ongoing basis and you're able to update that kind of spreadsheet or inventory over a period of time, it starts to be very valuable in saying,